Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the the almost world famous Three Body Problem podcast. This is episode 15, checking in with Juanito in Dublin over at Virus Bulletin. What's up, buddy?
Not much, man. Just trying to get the hotel setup going properly here. But it's been nice to be back at VB. I realized today it's like the seventh time I've spoken at VB. It's fucking insane. And
BB's.
just see, I mean, don't say anything. I picked up Costin's badge. He's got a 20-year pin on it. So,
Yeah,
I'm
they do cool stuff with this badge. Costin
yeah.
is checking in from Bucharest, Romania. What's going on, buddy? How's the taekwondo training going?
Yeah, it's on hold for the moment. I was in vacation in Greece with family, but got sick, so I had to fly back home. Now I'm better. I'm much better. But now wife is sick, my daughter is sick, so yeah, it's
Jesus,
moving.
Is summer over for you guys? Is the vacation summer season done?
It's done.
Never over.
Okay.
I think
Juan,
it's
let's
conference season.
It's conference season. Let's start right
It's
there.
always
with
conference season.
Let's start with VB. You had a talk there. We covered it last week. Anything new and interesting at VB this year? Dude, I looked at the pictures on LinkedIn. Folks post some pictures on LinkedIn. VB looked like it hasn't like even redesigned their badge in 20 years. It looks like the same piece of green text on that white paper on the badge. Everything just looks like, it looks like the last time I went to VB, which is like 10, 15 years ago.
It does have like a bit of a time machine
There's a
vibe,
nostalgic,
like,
yeah.
it is very nostalgic. Like it has not changed at all. Same graphics, like even like where the agenda graphics they put up, like they all look exactly the same. I mean, it's nice. It has this kind of comforting vibe. It being like an insider kind of conference for the AV industry. It did. I was a little sad to see it kind of like half full. You know what I mean? Like you kind of got the sense that like it wasn't a high energy conference. It was very low energy, very chill, which is kind of nice as an experience, but it also was a little disconcerting. Like it was a kind of like a strange feeling of maybe it's a little past its time, and that
It's
wasn't
always
cool.
been like
But
that, though.
yeah, maybe.
And it's always had good talks. I mean,
Yeah.
you'd have to wait through the agenda, but there's always had some good, important talks here. Some guys who wait for VB to showcase their work. And one of the things that stood out this year was from the agenda, just from me glancing at it, is the announcement of Careto 2.
Yeah.
Did you get a chance to watch that talk? What have we learned anything?
Yeah, actually, I actually watched it and then ran over here to do this recording. So I thought that was really interesting. I'm wondering if they're going to publish a blog post or I'm sure they had a private report on it already. But yeah, Careto 2 years after the fact, we finally get another glimpse at Careto. And I mean, that was one of the milk carton APTs, right? As we called them, right? Like the ones that popped up and never came back. It was like Flame. Animal Farm, Careto. At some
Yeah,
point,
Wild
we would have
Neutron.
said, yeah, Wild Neutron. At some point, we would have said Dooku, but Flame, Dooku have come back, and then Careto now come back. So that just leaves. I don't know if anyone's sitting on Animal Farm, but or Wild Neutron. But in any case, yeah, super interesting to see it kind of pop off. Also, I am fond of seeing this sort of thing out, but also an interesting thing to see kind of Kaspersky doing its thing, sort of publishing on the Western stuff, and I'm sure that'll spark some interesting conversations.
Costin, remind the folks what Careto is and why the public documentation of Careto 2 is interesting.
Yeah, so this was one of the unusual threat actors we uncovered back in the days. In the sense that this was one of those actors where you could see unusual words in, let's say, not typical languages. So in this case, it had some Spanish words. Some of them were like profanities, so we're not gonna utter them here. But it was
We only
interesting
curse in
because
English.
because of the victimology was also quite interesting there. I think it's not very often that you get to see victims in Gibraltar, which is a kind of unusual place to find, let's say, interesting APTs. And
One mentioned Western. We knew it was, we attributed it to whom?
It looked like a Western APT. I don't think it was ever.
Why are we always hedging
anyone.
and scratching our heads still? Like, who is
Because
correct?
we want to be precise. Like, unlike others,
That's
we
true.
speculate. So, like,
We don't
okay,
fact check, bro.
We don't fact check here.
We are solid. we are like doing like this historical
Let
stuff.
me
Like you
ask.
need
Let me
3
ask the
points.
questions if you guys aren't going to volunteer it. This is a Spain APT that was attributed to
The
Spain.
the prevailing sentiment is that this is a Spanish APT,
Thank you.
as in from
Okay.
Spain.
As in from
To
Spain.
be fair, even like, look, I'm with Costin on not doing sort of the like wishy-washy attribution, but I will say that just from a Spanish speaker's perspective, the particular type of cursing they were doing in those binaries would have pegged that country in a heartbeat. Like nobody else speaks like that. That said, all the usual, like having written the paper on like why you don't attribute things based on, just a couple of like language fragments, I don't love the idea of just kind
There's
of
been
like,
never been any objection over the years to anyone suggesting this is Spain, though, right? So, I mean, I
Yeah,
just
no.
want us to like have an honest, straightforward conversation. One of the things
Yeah.
they promised in the VB abstract was going to talk about leveraging an MDIM email server and exploiting a previously unknown bug in a security solution. Can you share any
Yeah.
details? What was the security product and what was the details around this server?
Well, I mean, I'll just say this. I didn't see any TLP or any kind of like marking on the talk, so I'm assuming that it's okay for me to like. I'm assuming they're going to put this
It
out
was
in the
on
blog. I have
stage at
no
Virus
idea. It was
Bulletin,
on
isn't it a
stage.
public talk? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just saying. I try to. I don't know. I don't know what they're gonna do. But in any case, the security solution was like Hitman Pro, which is kind of pretty old school stuff. And yeah, there's some MDaemon mail client that apparently had gotten popped, and they figured out some really interesting like missing configuration key that they could put their own DLL into that key. It was like the config 6 is out of 10 is missing.
Right.
So they would just write config 6 and point it at their own DLL, and that's how they would achieve sort of persistence and all. It was really, it was actually, I mean, it looked really cool. My understanding of how they were able to decide this was Careto, like a return of Careto, is a couple of pieces that I'm not going to say are flimsy. I don't mean that they're flimsy, but it's like a couple of small tidbits that like kind of let you on. I'm gonna assume, I've never seen samples, but I'm gonna assume it's been like completely re-engineered. But apparently they had these CRC32 hashes for the file names that when they cracked them were the same names as the components that were being used in Careto 1. And then apparently there might have been a victim overlap where they like popped the same organization in between, I think, 2019 and 2024, something like that. So it's nothing where you see like the same platform has returned, at least not from the way they described it. But it is one of those interesting things where it's just so hard to have a complete clean resurgence that, yeah, it seems like they caught the same dudes.
Any
Did
Go
they
ahead.
apologies? Did they mention anything about the victims or their location? Is it still Gibraltar or Cuba or?
They didn't give anything granular, but if I remember the slide correctly, there was one victim in Latin America and then one unidentified victim. So it seems pretty small spread. I mean, Latin America would still fit, but there were no more specifics than that. So
No surprise that this group reemerges, right? Costin, and what does it mean for like folks? I mean, if you're a potential target for these folks, the idea that they're still around shouldn't surprise anybody, right?
I think pretty much all the big groups that disappear, they just don't disappear. In reality, they're still around. We just don't know how to catch them again. So when something like that happens, it's interesting because it kind of suggests that these groups can be found again. And I guess that the most difficult part is connecting the dots, making sure that whatever new thing you found is actually an evolution of the old one. So this is probably like the most difficult thing, connecting them over the years. So like one example here would be that maybe, let's say we found Animal Farm or someone found Wild Neutron, but there's no way of connecting them back to the old operations. They're actually so different that it's impossible to connect them. So whenever this attribution through connection happens, I think that's really interesting.
Guys mentioned small and fatal mistakes made by some of the threat actors. I mean, I guess they documented some of that stuff. Juan, is that a typical thing this is this last connection point? Are we relying on them to make mistakes?
I mean, you always rely on some level of fallibility, but Also, the fact that you just have to like operate, right? Like there's no such thing as like perfect tradecraft or perfect invisibility. And I'm not sure that that's what these kinds of threat actors are necessarily striving for. But I didn't see, at least not from what they presented, that there was like categorical mistakes, right? I think they were just operating and they got caught in a couple of places. And frankly, like not getting caught for 10 years after having been outed is pretty impressive. Like, I don't know where the mistakes are. You're telling me you saw them with a new platform pop up twice that you barely attributed back to that same group, and they got outed in 2014. That was the first APT talk I ever attended in person.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that was the
with
first
music,
APT talk
with
I ever
musical
attended in
accompaniment. Who was
person.
it? What was the
It
song, Costin?
Vangelis. It was, I think it
Yes.
was like that. Yeah, they there was like this super
Conquest of
dramatic,
Paradise, yeah.
really well done talk. It was like Costin on stage,
1492.
and dude, that was my first, that was the first APT talk I ever saw in person. And from there you go 10 years before somebody catches them in like two small incidents. Like, I don't know. I appreciate that this is a really cool finding. I don't know that I'm looking at them being like, wow, did you guys fuck up? Like, I don't think so. Like, I think these guys are doing just fine. And it, I don't know. To me, I always wanted to see the resurgences. Like, I was always waiting for the milk carton APTs, and at some point I made a point of hunting some of them down, and like that's how we found like Flame 2.0, Dooku 1.5. But but the reason I really wanted to hunt them down was not out of any particular disdain for what they were doing, but rather, not only were they the most impressive and had been running for a really long period of time and exhibited a completely different mentality than the Chinese and the Russian that we were used to seeing all the time, but I was also really curious to see how they adapted to being burned, right? These are the systematic actors. These are the ones that are getting these like probably defense contractor level tooling and like all that stuff. Okay, what is the school of thought that develops from getting your whole platform categorically burned in a really public fashion when you're that mentality of actor? So I was just, that's what I wanted to see. And I think we learned a lot, like most of it when Dooku 2.0 pops up, but you just see like interesting new approaches to tackling the same thing with, you know, equation guys, Reagan guys, Flame, Dooku, and now Careto, right? Just seeing them pop off 6, 8, 10 years after the fact.
And I know you mentioned there's going to be a narrative around Kaspersky only outing Western groups. Shout out to Kaspersky for at least doing some research that no one else is doing. In the interest of the you know, the science of it, it's important that we get these documentations.
It's such a weird minefield right now, right? Because I've always been the one to kind of push for folks to like do the research, right? Do the research globally, out things, well, strategically, but also just look everywhere. And I don't want to be a hypocrite. I do think this kind of stuff needs to keep happening. My feelings have definitely gotten a lot more complicated with hot conflicts. And I guess maybe, you know, I understand some of the fervent objections that we would get from people who had done CT, like counterterrorism, in a previous life and would get really upset about some of these. I understand them a little bit more in the context of like current hot wars that we're a lot closer to right now.
But the more we know, the more we can put everything into context, the more like it's important that all this research, at least we have some visibility into what's happening, even if you don't go granular and you don't release all details, right?
Like this, that's the really shitty side of how some of these conversations play out. Like, I agree with, you know, if the Ukrainians or the Israelis or whomever were to come out and be like, come on, bro, like we're trying to win a war here. Like, can you just leave us alone for a little bit? I would completely understand that sentiment. At the same time, I think it's easier to swallow if there's this notion that in 5 years, we are going to revisit this, or we're going to come out and have a full disclosure or some semi-disclosure about how these things happen. Because the historian in me that's having a conversation with posterity is upset at the notion of whiting out a whole section with no intention of bringing that information back somehow. Like, the best we're going to get is some like David Sanger-esque retelling by somebody who knew somebody who told somebody who told Sanger, who didn't fact check it, and now that's the only like recording that we have for the rest of history. Like that part bums me out.
Costin, you got some thoughts on this? You were a key part of a lot of this decision making. You're not too far removed from it. Any thoughts on just the history, the science, the paleontology of it, mixing with the politics of it, like Juan said, in hot zone conflict areas where it starts to get murky? You got a thought on?
Yeah, I would say that one of the let's say interesting sides here would be that you never publish everything you have. Whenever you have, let's say, some research, you research it as hard as possible, and you try to pull all the strings, go in all the possible directions. But sometimes, they just don't pan out. Like some of these directions in investigating, they don't give you, let's say, more clarity or more visibility. So when you publish the research, you publish what makes sense. So it's quite often that there's, let's say, some strange modules that, they were on the same victim, and maybe some infrastructure that you explored, but you couldn't fully attribute it to the same operation. It still remains. So yeah, I like revisiting these things a lot. It's possibly what let's say we call paleontology, and what we find the most similar to the same concept, exploring these lost dinosaur bones. Here with Careto, one of the most interesting things to me was the fact that there were quite a few victims in the United Kingdom, if I remember correctly, which were certain kind of technology companies, and I was always surprised about the fact that Western, supposedly Western APTs would be spying on Western countries. So like these Western on Western threat actors doesn't happen very often. I did see a couple of days ago a discussion of where certain U.S. government fellows were saying that for them, like one of the top actors outside Russia, besides China, it's France. So like one of the things that they are most worried about is France. So you don't get to see this Western on Western action too often. And I think Careto was one of these examples where you could see some really interesting Western on Western action. So for me, it would be interesting to see if that happens still. Like, of course, nowadays, Europe is a totally different place, and things happen in a much more different manner than 10 years ago. So it'd be interesting to see if there's still victims in the UK for Careto 2 or 3 or 4 or 5.
Anything else about VB before we move on? Anything
There were
else
tons of
interesting?
good talks. There were tons. Honestly, like I'm kind of doing it a disservice, but just from the ones that I watched, I mean, Nicole and Ryan from Inteaser both gave this great talk on Hamas operations on Wildcard and how it connected to electric powder and rust down and some of that stuff. Joe Slowick talked about acid rain in the context of sort of like the broader Viasat hack, and a lot of sort of really emphasized some of the network components and how starting from like what sounded like probably some kind of appliance having been the first stage, as happened with so many of the things in Ukraine, to the way that sort of they tunneled through that network. There was also a great talk by I believe, Argentinian guy out of ESET. God, I can't remember his name, but he gave a talk about Golden Jackal, which was really interesting in that it was considered sort of like a like hybrid criminal group, maybe doing some espionage. I remember Gianpaolo at Kaspersky was the first one to publish on it. But what the ESET guys showed was that they also had a couple of air gap jumping toolkits across the years, and started to suggest that it might be a group more like closely related to Turla. They also mentioned Mustache Bouncer in the same context, which I think is super interesting because I'm an avid fan of Turla operations, but I have to be the first. I'll admit that I think they have morphed, changed, reorged, and split in ways that I don't readily understand. I think there's a lot of groups operating under what could have been considered some kind of Turla umbrella, and I can't keep track of it. So I'm really interested when you start to get a sense of some of that stuff. And So just a lot of really good material sort of interwoven amongst all the talks.
Let's switch gears quickly to some of the latest hot button topics in our world. We have a new version of IDA out that apparently has gone subscription model, and people are on Twitter complaining about pricing and where this is all heading. Hexrays was sold, a little bit of background, Hexrays was sold by a private equity firm, and it seems like they're redoing the pricing model and the way the software is going to be shipped. This is one of the most important pieces of software for you reversers. Question here is, what changed? Are you guys following this? What changed? And are these legitimate complaints? Because people complain about IDA pricing forever. What's new here?
I'm following relatively closely, in part because I've been kind of working with the Hexrays guys a little bit. Like Nicole Fishbein from Inteaser and I have been working on sort of all this like tooling for Rust reversing, and we were talking with the Hexrays folks, and they were letting us know like we're in the beta for IDA 9 and everything. So I kind of knew that a subscription change was coming. And that in itself was not alarming to me because, frankly, I think Hexray's pricing model has been awful for many, many years. Like it just, like I was kind of hoping that a change meant a change towards like greater sanity. Maybe it's not cheaper, but if it's more sane, that sounds nice. So I wasn't alarmed at the thought that this was happening until you kind of see some of the way the details come down. And then I think they're making a mistake by essentially...
Hold on a second. What are these details?
Okay. So the change is a slightly more sane pricing model in the sense that you're no longer paying necessarily for each decompiler. You can have like more of a standardized license. You can get like IDA teams and like this collaborative stuff. Like all these things that were more like add-ons are more of like a normal part of the subscription. And look, IDA is really expensive, but like for what I pay for my license right now with 4 decompilers, in the new model, I would get all decompilers. So in that sense, sounds great, except that they took subscription model like really literally. So my understanding now is that if you stop paying for it, the software is essentially like more or less disabled. Like what I was reading is that you can keep reversing with your IDBs in your IDA 9, but if the license is not valid, like you can't save any of the changes. Like it's for downloaded software that lives on your machine, this is very unusual. Like it's not necessarily it's not the same subscription modeling that you would normally get. So people are upset about that, but I think where they really messed up in the rollout of this is not honoring the existing licenses. So like the whole point of IDA licensing was, if I have a valid license right now, any update you release, I'm going to get that update. So I go from IDA 8 to IDA 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, and then my license runs out. You roll out 8.4. It's no longer mine until I go pay for a valid license. Now, even though, like, let's say we updated our licenses or renewed our licenses 3 months ago. As far as I understand from the current pricing model, even though our licenses are valid for another 9 months, we are not getting IDA 9 unless we go do some kind of new licensing renewal thing. So that's what's pissing people off the most. I think you could have kind of offloaded the fear and concern about what happens when my license runs out to like, well, that's a problem for me in a year. But instead, people are so pissed right now that their current licenses are not being honored that it's taking all the steam out of what would have otherwise been a very exciting rollout of a lot of features that people have been asking for a long time.
Costin, why do people put up with this abusive relationship from Hexrays? And I ask that because that's all I hear is people complaining about this. And in fairness to Hexrays, they do great innovation and they ship a product, and they should reap the rewards of shipping a product that makes your life easier. Is there the complaints about pricing? Is that always legitimate in your mind? Because you were a part of a research team with, I would imagine, unlimited budget. But why do people put up with this?
I feel the pain in the sense that, I mean, back in the days, our IDA budget was pretty high, pretty much, you know, for every new person we were hiring in the team, we would need to buy a new license. Yeah, of course, we could buy like several licenses which in advance, which is actually what we were doing. But nevertheless, it was a lot of money for this. Now, why people put up with IDA? I think we kind of grew up with it. I grew up with IDA. I've been using it for decades, essentially. I know there's more and more people using Guidra nowadays, but at least in my experience, Hexrace was superior to Guidra, so which is why I think a lot of people keep using it. The other pain here, I think, for everyone is whenever there's a new version of IDA, if you load your older IDB files in the new version and you save them, it's essentially game over. You won't be able to load them again in the old version. So with IDA 9, if you somehow, let's say, you load them in the new version and you hope that you're gonna be able to temporarily continue your analysis with IDA 8, while you maybe upgrade your license or your subscription for IDA 9, no, you won't be able to do that. So they'll be like disabled during that period.
That's a really important point. And honestly, I discussed it with the Hexrace guys directly, but frankly, IDA Pro is one of those anchors that you factor in before you quit a job in security, right? Like things that you think about. I'm not going to have access to VirusTotal. I'm not going to have access to IDA Pro updates, like maybe not even have access to my IDA Pro license. Like if you had like a server license, then the minute you quit, you're like, oh, I'm just going to leave these essential tools of my trade behind. And I hope that my next job will bring those, because, you know, most researchers aren't going to quit their job and then drop 10K on tools and then try to get a subscription they can't get. So there are things that I think are actually quite important. Now I see Synapse, Vertex Synapse serving as a similar kind of anchor, where it's like people don't want to leave this tool that they love. In a way, I was hoping the subscription model would introduce a level of sanity that could mean, for example, greater transferability and some kind of stability for researchers. Like if I have a license at SentinelOne and then I quit tomorrow, or I get fired for saying some dumb shit on a podcast, then I want, like, if I could just turn that license into a personal license by paying them an extra $1,000 or whatever, I have a continuity of work that, you know, gives me some peace of mind. The idea now that yet another thing is contingent on my day-to-day employment, it's just it adds a level of stress to thinking about transferability. And as much as I'm perfectly happy with my job, I always look at these little dog whistle like concerns that upset me about the independence of researchers being able to continue to do what they do.
And the idea that people are so entrenched in the IDA ecosystem that there's a lot of friction to moving to something new, that's real? Or are you guys all playing with all Binary Ninja, Guidra, whatever the pronunciation is? Like, what's the reality of your world?
I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I feel like I'm speaking too much, but like I have a lot of thoughts on this one, because
go. We don't fact check.
Thank God. No, what I've been thinking about this for a long time. That's the deal. That's the deal. No fact checking. Okay.
No fact check.
Anyways, I was gonna make a JD Vance joke, but let's just leave that one there.
You have the beard.
Well, no eyeliner. So if you think about it, there's these three big tools, and really there's always been two big tools. It was Ghidra and IDA Pro, but Ghidra, all the people that are excited about Ghidra being open source more than anybody else were the people who were using Ghidra in the government and walked out, and now they have their tool back and they feel very comfortable with it. And I'm happy for them. But like, then you have IDA Pro, which is what most everybody uses. And it is an abusive relationship in some ways. Like, the support has never been that great. It's always had all kinds of bugginess and whatnot, but it is a really powerful and amazing tool. Like, I love it to death, as much as like I hate a lot of things about how it's been engineered. There's no substitute. So what happens when the NSA drops Ghidra is actually something really meaningful for the industry that they haven't gotten enough credit for. Even though they've gotten credit, they haven't gotten enough credit, which is, before, if you wanted to learn how to reverse engineer at a high level, the only way you would ever get access to a decompiler at all that was half decent was to work for a big company that could buy you an IDA Pro license or to try to use a cracked license from somewhere. There really wasn't a high quality decompiler available at all. So that whole paradigm of abstraction was just not available to you as a college student, as anything. And that changes with, well, Binary Ninja and with Ghidra being introduced. So Ghidra gets introduced as this open source thing, and people rejoice, even though there are things about it that, like, I don't ever want to use. I don't want to install Java. I don't want to write Jython. I don't want to deal with the weirdnesses of Ghidra. But at the same time, it also has this amazing power, which is anything that Ghidra can disassemble, it can decompile, which is different to IDA Pro, where you have to buy each decompiler per architecture. Anyways, to end this long rant, Binja comes along, they re-implement the same mentality as Ghidra into Binja, which means anything it can disassemble, it can decompile, but it's much better for vulnerability research and whatnot. Binja is the obvious future. It's like, it's affordable, it's well supported, it's built to a modern standard, it can run headless, it's API forward, etc. But right now, changing to it is painful from a malware analysis perspective or whatever. Like, the muscle memory is not there. Things look a little different. Things are just different enough where you have to make a sacrifice and, like, plunge into the depths of something uncomfortable to migrate. But that's really the only thing that's been keeping people. So
What
I
about the
think you're going to
pricing?
see that reckoning. Oh, the pricing is phenomenal. Binja's gone up in price a bit since it came out, and it's still less than, it's like $1,000. It's like, it's a completely affordable thing, and you have different prices for commercial versus, you know, students versus individual. It's just really reasonable, and the only subscription is if you want their, like, AI capabilities, and that's like $20 a month. So they're doing something great. They're starting their own reversing conference to try to, like, um, basically lead where Recon is kind of falling apart, which, again, very excited about that. So, like, I am very clear that Binja is the future. I think in my prayers at night, I hope that I can somehow make it from IDA Pro to Binja without ever having to fall into Ghidra. That's my hope.
All right, Jordan, there's your ad. Clip it and push your ad. Shout out to our friend
Come
Jordan, who's
on.
working on Binary Ninja and is a good guy who not only is doing humans work, but, you know, listens to feedback and is always working on improving things for folks. Costin, last words on that before we move on?
I was thinking that pretty much like Juan, I love Binary Ninja. I was thinking there's
another ad now?
Yeah, but I think there's still an opportunity here, kind of a niche, which would be for someone to take Ghidra and turn it into some kind of a commercial solution, like integrated with some more features, AI, more support, more plugins, if you want. I think there's an opportunity.
There's room for innovation there?
There's room. Yeah, I think there's room. Yeah.
Interesting.
Pretty like similar, you know, the in the Linux world, you have things like, I don't know, like Ubuntu and then the Ubuntu Pro subscription, or Red Hat and CentOS. So I think the same would be feasible here, like a version of Ghidra in the range, you know, between $100 and $500, somewhere there, with a lot more features, support, AI integration, and so on.
All right, to the 3 VCs listening, there's a free idea from Costin. Speaking of tooling, I want to touch quickly on the release of new YARA, Costin, YARA 0.9.0, YARA X. There's
YARA X.
some conversation around FMT commands.
Mm-hmm.
What's the significance of new YARA out? Are you excited? What's the buzz in your world?
Yeah, so YARA X is a from scratch rewrite of YARA in Rust. So there's a lot of people now embracing Rust because it's memory safe. The possibility of exploiting Rust is much smaller than the typical C code, if you want. And at least in my experience, Rust code is much faster somehow. And in case of YARA X, I've been doing a lot of testing since last week released the first versions of YARA X, and for me it's faster. It's significantly faster than the traditional YARA. So I've been trying to integrate YARA-X in pretty much all my workflow, in all my systems. I've been reporting a number of bugs which got fixed. So the most recent version of YARA-X is a lot more stable than the first one. Is I can actually scan my clean sample collection, my malware collection without crashing. The funny thing here was that although it's written in Rust, it was still crashing on certain samples, mostly in external libraries that they integrated in YARA-X. So with version 09 now being available, I think we are getting closer and closer to the 1.0 release of YARA-X, and I think this is also what Victor Manuel Alvarez has said, that this is the future. In the near future, probably YARA, the traditional YARA, will be discontinued, and everything will continue with YARA-X. And yeah, the FMT command is a good example here, because this FMT is typical of Golang. I think some Golang tools, they allow you to format the source code in a certain way, because to be honest, like I've seen thousands of YARA rules, and everyone writes these rules differently, like with tabs, with spaces, indentation. I mean, everybody has a different style. Even me, I have my own style of writing YARA rules, and sometimes you can actually guess who wrote the YARA rule by simply looking at the rule. Like without any attribution, author, whatever, you say, yeah, I know who wrote this YARA rule, because they put spaces between the variable and the equal, but not afterwards or before the quotes.
Does that affect each other's work, though?
No.
I guess it does, in the sense that when
like, why do you care how Juan writes it?
I care. I mean, well, if I want to debug his rule, if I want to improve his rule, I need to essentially to feel comfortable with the rule. And what I do, I tell you honestly, whenever somebody publishes a YARA rule, and to be honest, I read pretty much all the blogs that everyone publishes, Mandiant, ESET, Kaspersky, everyone. I get the YARA rules from there. I save them in my local database. I run them on all my collections and so on.
Even the CISA one?
Oh, don't get me started there. Oh,
come on, even man. We've already gone down this path.
We've been there. But I go through all the YARA rules, and I'll be honest, like generally they're a disaster. Some of them are good, but most of them are a disaster. They're missing like the meta section. They don't have an author. They don't have a reference. You don't know where they came from, who wrote them. So I manually polish all the rules, like reformat them, align them, realign them how I like them, which is a significant amount of work.
Do you think the tool should shift people towards a format, or do you think this is just the way it's going to always be?
I think it's nice when the author of the tool says, like, this is the format. Yeah, when the author says, from now on, this is how the rules need to look like.
I'm so disappointed. I'm so disappointed on that. Like, okay, I am in no position to talk about YARA-X. I have had to. I'm coming back to the master. I pinged Costin, and I admitted that I have not played with YARA-X at all. And I have asked for
training.
I've asked for a private training next week so that I can learn about YARA-X. I will say that my excitement about having like a format command, because I like Go a lot, and I will say, to Go's credit, I don't know of any other language where you have that consistency of like readable code. Like the readability of the code in Go is just phenomenal. I can look at something that I wrote or someone else wrote 2 years ago, and it's relatively maintainable. So I was kind of hoping that this meant that we were going to go down that route with YARA. But that's tempered by the idea that like we're not imposing a standard. So now if people use this format, they can still choose their quirky ass format and it'll be consistent, but you're still not talking about things just, someone's got to be like the grammar Nazi. Someone's got to be the standards fascist that decides what it's going to look like. But at least it means that even if we hate it, it'll look the same. And I think that would be a nice thing to see come down the pipe.
the same conversation we just had around hex rays and abusive relationships. I want to connect this conversation to the same conversations I hear around the abusive relationship between VirusTotal and its users and its customers around pricing, around, just limits to what you can and can't do. Are there some thoughts here on we're all getting standardized on their systems? There are no alternatives. And when we talked in the last segment, we talked about Binary Ninja and Ghidra at least being alternatives. There are no alternatives to VirusTotal, and it feels like researchers are constantly complaining that they're in this abusive relationship. Is that a fair assessment of where we are with that?
This is painful. This is like a painful conversation. I do think there is that weird kind of difficulty with VT. And it sucks because, like, I think we all love it. Like, I do deep in bottom of my heart, like, I love VirusTotal, and it has given me so many rewarding, like, experiences and findings, and I love it to death, and I never want to lose access.
Clip that, Vicente.
I'm just saying, like, I never want to lose my access to it.
And you used to work there, right?
I worked at Chronicle when Chronicle owned VT, and it also like gave me a different perspective on it. And frankly, I mean, without getting too into the depths of whatever, I do think Chronicle put too much pressure on VirusTotal, like before Google Cloud became involved. So to be fair, I think Chronicle wanted to live off of the ARR of VT before it launched Backstory, before it launched its own product. And it put so much pressure on VirusTotal to become some kind of cash cow that it wasn't meant to be. So I think that the fault is kind of in my era, not that it was my decision, but at the time, like that, I think that's what kind of kicks off this like massive ramping up of pricing. At the same time, I don't know. I think the market has also kind of failed to produce a natural alternative. Like you have Reversing Labs, which most people point to as an alternative, but it isn't. It has never had feature parity, and I think there's like a really strange mentality towards discussing the content and the source, like the true content and source of samples, which makes it, I think they think it makes you think there's more there than there actually is. Instead, to me, it makes it seem unreliable and shady in a way that it doesn't need to be. But like if there was a, like I haven't played Reversing Labs in ages, but there was a time when like you would go in and like make up a hash, and as long as it had the right number of like letters and numbers, it would pretend that it knew it, even though it didn't have it. So like stuff like that makes you feel like, okay, this isn't a source of ground truth. At best, maybe I'll find other stuff here, but it isn't an equivalent service. And then like if I'm gonna cast stones anywhere, like I would be disingenuous not to own up to the fact that like I'm a co-founder to an attempt at a replacement that has kind of floundered along the way and hasn't found its way to market as an effective competitor. So it does make me feel really deflated about the notion of getting a genuine ecosystem of competitors in this space. And I think that's important because the element that you don't see advertised in the modern VT is the community side of things, which is to say the sourcing side of things. Like you need to foster a community of antiviruses, of EDRs, of whatever, NGOs, whomever, to get good sample sources. And it kind of, you get the sense that like the sample sources and the community element have been steadily dropping since like 2016. And now you have a product that is like way more expensive. We still love it. It has a lot more features than before, but it wants to become some weird Intel platform, which it isn't. And it's not courting better sources of like intake and samples. So what is its value supposed to be? Like, I don't want VT as a tip. It's never meant to be that. So like, it's supposed to be the samples, and the samples are not really flowing in the way they were before. So what is supposed to fuel this industry? What's supposed to be its raw materials, its prime matter for the coming, 5 years?
Costin, there's never been shortage of talk of replacing VirusTotal over the years. I remember the old employer, they were always talk about building our own, building our own. There was always risk of your stuff gets stolen and, this gripe. Why has no one been able to build an alternative to VirusTotal? I mean, there's millions and millions and millions of VC dollars. Why are no one building something like this? Is it difficult? Has that market been completely, what? Again, same thing with IDA and Hex-rays. Why isn't there a burgeoning?
I think from a VC point of view, if you have some money you want to invest, you put them in a project that brings you essentially a lot of money back. And I don't think that, to be honest, when Google bought VirusTotal, their idea was just to keep it alive and keep it as a valuable resource for the community, not to turn it into a cash cow. And to be honest, Bernardo, a very good friend of mine, and we discussed, I think, in the past that VT also has some costs, like operational costs, which are actually quite high.
Significant.
And that's, in my opinion, I think it's the fundamental thing here and the issue that is difficult to create something like VirusTotal that is also profitable. That's super, super difficult. You need some kind of, let's say, funding or support. I think that, for instance, the Russian government was working and they deployed some kind of a VirusTotal for their purposes, but again, with a very limited number of engines. So I think that the true value of VirusTotal, it always came from the fact that they had a lot of engines, they had all this fantastic unpacking support, the ability to run the YARA rules on all the incoming samples, and the ability to download the samples. But again, the profitability question, kind of comes back here.
Do you think, I know they've now moved VirusTotal into Mandiant Intelligence as part of all this big restructuring. Do you think, Juan, that the drive to turn it into a cash cow, a profitability thing changes with that little bit of narrow restructuring there? One, and two, just to dovetail on what Costin just said, the fact that it's hard to do shouldn't stop anyone else from attempting to do it. And I noticed you gritting your teeth when he said it's almost impossible to create an alternative.
Yeah. So the second question, let me address the second question first, which is, I do think it is doable. I've seen it done in a more profitable and performant way, but you are also living, whatever new solution comes along is living in a post-VirusTotal world that is owned by Google. And I think there's some hesitation that comes with fighting with the giant in a way that maybe has made some folks too scared to take the right steps to actually do it. At the same time, I don't know. I don't think there's a legitimate reason for there not to be Stairwell should be a legitimate competitor to VT. It just hasn't been handled in the right way for it to do so effectively. And that hurts me because I love it, and I don't want a world where there's only a Stairwell or there's only a VirusTotal. I want both to exist. I want both to be sourcing files. I want them to compete. I want them to develop and have an incentive to drive prices down and to improve services, right? That's what, you don't want a monoculture and you don't want a monopoly of services. I want to see this healthy competition. So that's the part that kind of hurts me about the whole thing, but it is absolutely doable, completely doable. To answer the first question, I think Chronicle times was when the pressure was put on VT to become a cash cow. I don't know what's happening now necessarily, but the pressure I see on VT now is different. It's about it being a kind of platform and portal, and integrating the Mandiant reports into the portal, integrating the IOCs into the thing, and you get fancy graphs and stuff out of it. And I think that that's the kind of decision making that an executive that thinks they're a threat intel practitioner is making, because no threat intel practitioner, no malware analyst is looking at VirusTotal and going, this is my intelligence platform. This is where I'm going to do my work. That's fucking ridiculous. That is
right,
not at all how this shit works.
There's a VP there with a goal to expand TAM and find more market share and trying to find new users beyond just right?
You're talking about numbers here. This is Google. There's a VP there who just wants a promotion. It's a good perf cycle.
My point is they have to expand the target audience for the target buyer. It's not just necessarily. So I mean, we
No,
get
no,
the
no.
idea.
Dude, we do not apply market discussions like market logic to Google things or Microsoft things. Like that, you're talking about funny money, trust fund kid bullshit. Like it's a different
Fair
kind of
enough.
math. No, we're not talking about a market at all. You're definitely not talking about market fit because if you were talking about market fit, you would be hearing how many people are trying to like dovetail out of their contracts and upset at the prices. How many people have been left at the table with money on hand who were just told, "Oh, you only have 200,000? We only want 300,000, so fuck off." And you're like, come on, man. Like there's a whole lot of customers that a more organic business would be looking to court any and all customers it can have rather than doing that googly thing of like this tall to ride and like, oh, I guess you just don't get the privilege of having access to it. You're like, that's it's just not the right mentality. And frankly, I don't think it befits the mentality of who the heart I know to be in VirusTotal, right? Like those guys are awesome. The Malaga guy, like that house full of people who just like love that shit. They're good people. They're not interested in playing this game. You're just seeing the weather at Google taking this ship and battering it from one side to the other. Like you need to be this, you need to serve that. You are the Intel platform. I cannot imagine anyone at Mandiant who's actually doing the research is looking at them going, VirusTotal is a threat intel platform. Those people just want Synapse, okay? Like that's all they want. And you're like some executive is just like beating them down with their bullshit.
Costin, are we having this same conversation a year from now? Do things get better there, do you think? I feel like, I feel again, this is one of those, like with IDA, this is one of those conversations where everyone hates VT, but nobody can get rid of VT and everybody has to pay whatever premium.
I would disagree that everyone hates VT. On the contrary, like everybody loves VT. What they hate is the price. I mean, I think
Who
at
does?
the last two conferences where I have been, a lot of people came to me essentially complaining about the fact that prices are going up. Is it the inflation? I don't know. Maybe inflation, war, economy, depression, whatever is coming. Third World War. But the prices are going up, and it's essentially forcing everyone to tighten their budgets. So the amount of money they can spend on that, unfortunately, cannot get any bigger. I was thinking that while on the topic of VT and alternatives there, well, maybe it's a good idea to give a shout out to Silas with his Malshare project. I think that
Yeah.
what he was trying to do there from the beginning was to have some kind of an alternative for researchers who lose their jobs and they lose IDA, they lose the malware access, and to have some kind of a website where you can still find some samples. So yeah, shout out to Silas for his Malshare project.
I mean, it's really
Always.
the main like independent one. Like I was surprised, for example, when Cyber Command started to upload samples and like distribute samples that they didn't have an issue going with like a commercial vendor, but like they could have just pushed the mouse share. It's like kind of like the Dropbox of the industry where you can actually
Right.
put stuff and you're not worried about people having to pay a certain amount to be able to share. But look, there's a lot of community stuff in this space, or there's always been a propensity towards that. I do want to see more of that. I understand that a community project cannot take like the exorbitant run rate of hosting petabytes in the cloud, but we're creative fucking people. Like, where are our P2P projects? Like, where are some of the things that we might want to create just to be a resilient industry? And hopefully to incentivize a whole host of people who have samples to share and are open to sharing them, but don't want to do so on a commercial platform. Like, I do think the commercial platforms need to find a way to court those folks, and the community needs to find a way to invite those folks, give them value, and expand our collective visibility.
But if Costin is right and we're totally overestimating this market, there is no money to be made here, then again, like why should people innovate and spend their hard-earned money on innovating in an area where the time isn't there?
I think the issue we have here is manifold, but frankly, the discussions of value have been coming up a lot, and I've been one of the people actually driving them. I think there's a variety of misalignments here that make this look very barren when it isn't, right? Cybersecurity is an important function and in a qualitative sense and in a quantitative sense. And if you want to focus on TAM, I think the problem with the threat intelligence market is that researchers didn't want to do business. They found a way to justify getting to do research, which was to sell the shit they wrote. And that was like what we gave the salespeople to sell, and they tried to price it in their own way, and they ran that thing into the fucking ground. They were trying to get as much money out of it as possible, but that is not the most effective way to share indicators. It is not the most effective way to solve problems. It is not the most effective way to secure anyone. It's just that we didn't really want to do business. And I challenge people in threat intel to consider what it would mean to build effective distribution mechanisms and effective ways of like enforcement and sharing and so on. And you'll find that entire markets will breed around that, the same way that us writing some stupid reports became a source of recurring revenue where nobody would have ever thought that possible. So I think we're just not giving the salespeople anything to work with.
And I think, Costin, I think there's enough ARR at VirusTotal to be a functional business even outside of Google. It's not like this is a tiny market. If you spun that out and say, okay, go off and do your own thing as a private, they don't need to lean on Google to survive.
Well, they're being asked to however many X their profits in a way that they wouldn't need to, right? Like if we're just talking about costs and making money, it's a small team of people. If they were an independent company right now, the money they're making, I have a feeling, would more than make them a successful company. But instead, you're looking at what would be a very profitable, very valuable company having to make numbers that are worthy of moving the Google Cloud like revenue line. And that's you're asking for something impossible.
Yeah. All right, I want a quick hit on a couple of news items. We don't have a lot of time. We're already at the 1 hour mark, so we're going to quick hit these as fast as we can. Microsoft and the Department of Justice, the US DOJ, made some news yesterday around disrupting domains associated with spear phishing attacks of Star Blizzard. Star Blizzard is an FSB-linked APT out of Russia. Costin, is this one of those reports we dismissed because there are no IOCs, or were we able to gather enough IOCs out of the court documents to make this interesting and useful?
I find it very funny that in order to get the IOCs out, you have to go to the court documents. To me, this is like the funniest thing here. And we were discussing it, I think, yesterday in our friends group, how to extract the IOCs and using OpenAI ChatGPT to OCR the PDF file, which is scanned images. Like, come on, like in 2024, surely we can do better than OCRing court documents for.
And you blame Microsoft for this, right? Like Microsoft should be documenting this better. Not blaming, but I mean, Microsoft should.
I'm frustrated a bit in the sense that surely we can do better than court documents, scanned images that we have to OCR. And thank you, by the way, for OCRing that big PDF, Ryan. I tried to do the same with my ChatGPT, which I don't know, maybe because it's from Romania, doesn't want to take that American court documents. I have no idea why. It said like that. Yeah, you can't do any more of those
and the
intelligence queries today.
We'll never know if we did it accurately because the press release says it was 100+ domains. I was only able to extract 92 or
90 something. Yeah.
So we're never sure. Juan, we're talking about imposing costs on these APTs. These guys will never go away. You'll never get rid of them. This adds a tiny cost. You've kind of like disrupted a couple of domains they've used for spear phishing. Is this a significant thing, or do they flip and move on, and this is just kind of like a little tiny blip?
Sure that it's not a crippling thing, and I don't know. I don't love the whole imposed cost thing in isolation, because it seems very atomic, right? Like in a way. I would like to think that something like this is part of a like death by 1,000 cuts strategy, wherein hopefully you've been doing other things in the background, then you do this kind of indictment and seizure, that like opens the door for more activities to be done. It hopefully incentivizes a lot of private industry to be a part of it, but then also, like they mentioned in the article, now you have an existing court standing that is going to allow you to take down these domains as they pop up.
As
So
they
in
pop.
theory, what you've done is open the door, and this is a strategy that Microsoft in particular has employed to some level of effectiveness in the past, starting with APT28 Fancy Bear domains. There was some controversy in the research community at the time because they also felt the liberty to strong arm other researchers into handing them APT28 domains that had been sinkholed before, which was pretty shitty. But in any case, you still are talking about them using this kind of court instrument as an open door with which to now start legitimately seizing control of all these domains, sinkholing them, getting telemetry, getting visibility into victims, et cetera, et cetera.
Clearly not all the domains either, because there are domains that Microsoft doesn't have visibility into other platforms that they use for some of the spear phishing or the mail infrastructure, right? So this is just kind of like a little tiny disruption thing. I don't want, the headlines say Microsoft and DOJ disrupt star, whatever star it is, whatever blizzard it is.
Democratic institutions from cyber threats.
Correct. Meanwhile, we've just removed a couple of domains. Let's putting it into perspective. It's just a little tiny thing, right?
I want to say that yes, it is, but again, this is the beginning of more activity, right? So if this lets them, if you get into a position where, let's say, having this court, this indictment also means that they can talk to the registrars and get some greater visibility and get some faster turnaround around domains. You suddenly get very effective, and for every, I don't know, 12 domains they spin up in a week, you're able to take down 8 in a matter of like minutes or hours. That amounts to something, right? That does create something meaningful. That means follow through, that means collaboration, that means sticking with it. But yeah, I mean, I don't think we should just dismiss it outright. We have a terrible paradigm right now of a lack of like enforcement instruments, and we should be happy when we see one of them being utilized, no matter how archaic or twisted it has to get in order to function.
And even though we get a blog post out of Microsoft without IOCs, the Microsoft threat intel folks are pretty impressive. They do pretty impressive work, right? That's the general sentiment. Is that fair?
Mystic is respected, above most teams, and they should be. They're phenomenal. I only hesitate.
I'm just trying to see how reliable is the quality of the work we're looking at.
I think the reliability of Mystic's work is unimpeachable, but the people that wrote this report are this goddamn DCU unit.
Yes, as soon as you see that on the issues blog, that's your cue.
So I don't know, someone else is preparing for a perf cycle, but I don't know how reliable this is really going to be in that sense. But hey, if they're just getting the info from Mystic and rebranding it for themselves, cool, whatever.
Staying in Russia very quickly, our friend Thomas Rid had a big article out on doppelganger and Russian influence operations, the previous indictment and U.S. law enforcement activity. One of the things is Thomas Rid got access to 2.4 gigs of leaked SDA data. And what he found generally was they were largely overestimating their impact on some of these influence operations things. We here in the US make a big deal out of it, obviously, because it's, it's the silly season, the silly election season. Costin, you got a chance to read the Thomas Rid article. Is there any significance to that? And is there any surprise that they're doing very little but telling the home base that they're winning the race?
Well, I thought that the article was very, very interesting, and there were people saying that this is the best article written about Russian influence ops, like ever. The best article. Obviously, Thomas is the expert on the topic, and he's written a number of very interesting books as well, which, of course, we highly recommend. But what I think in this particular case, the idea that, they're kind of hyping the impact, I think that this probably happens pretty much everywhere. When it's quite difficult to measure in a, let's say, mathematical way the impact of that operation. Now, if you ask me, I think we discussed it before. I think that these operations do have an impact. They're not gonna change the elections in the sense let's say one candidate is gonna win with 60% instead of losing with 30%. No, the impact will be in the range of 2%, 1.5%, something like very small. But over time, and here the big difference here, I think, is that with Western operations, Western governments, everyone's planning, for 4 years. That's an election cycle. Then a new president comes and, just changes all the directors, a new director of intelligence, whatever. And then they say, like, from now on, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do a different kind of thing. In China and Russia, it's quite different because, the president is going to be in power for 50 years or 100 years or 200 years, who knows? The vision is like super long term. And for them, 4 years, that's nothing. What they're looking at is what's going to be the impact of these operations for the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. And if pushing these operations for 10, 15, 20 years is gonna, change the opinion of people, I don't know, in Europe about migrants or migration, and it's gonna help certain parties, like the far-right parties, gain more population over time. I think that's a significant thing. And in my opinion, and I know a lot of people disagree, but I think that these operations are more significant and they are more impactful than most people are willing to recognize, especially because we are looking back like for a very short period of time. We are only saying like, over the last year, the impact has been negligent. But I say, what about the impact over the last 5 years, over like the last 10 years?
Yeah.
And let's look again in 5 years and say what's been the impact over the last 15 years.
So you're suggesting Thomas Reid is not paying attention to the long chess game that's at play. He's measuring, he's attempting to measure like in a shorter cycle, and that's a mistake.
I think it's good to say that these operations don't work because when people financing these operations actually read the article saying that they don't work, maybe they're gonna cancel them or stop investing. So in practice, it's good. If they listen to our podcast and if they listen to me, then probably they're gonna say, so our money actually matter. And I think I asked a couple of weeks ago, I asked on Twitter, if you have like let's say a budget of a couple $1 million, what do you do with them? And I think it was the Grok, if I'm not mistaken, who actually said, he's just gonna do influence operations. Like it's the most efficient usage of any budget.
I think the issue with this side of things that really gets to me is I'm not surprised that these dudes, like dweebs in Russia, are like trying to like make themselves seem 10 feet tall. It also, I think, is a bit of a slap in the mouth to a lot of the Russia apologists who like wanted to see people just making completely wild fabrications out of like this Russian intention to interfere. Like, dude, political technologism is a thing in Russia, and it's almost considered a career, and it's always been treated as a legitimate thing since Soviet times, and whatever, forward to Soviet Russia times. But what you're missing here is that there is no countering disinformation by virtue of taking down disinformation distribution channels in democratic countries in the long term. The only thing that helps with these sorts of situations is like education. And we're not doing absolutely anything to increase discernment in Western nations, which is why like it's all a swamp of lies, and like everybody seems to have accepted that they're living according to somebody's propaganda, and it's this like continual nihilism. But there is a path forward. It's just not an easy one, in the sense that you don't have clear authoritative sources that you could point to saying whenever whatever comes out of the Associated Press, that's true, and then everything else is like completely biased or whatever. But you also don't have a population that's being taught to discern, at least not in the US, right? Like there is no educational move forward of any kind. And as long as that doesn't happen, you are going to have you're not investing into the next generation or the generation after that having any kind of discernment. So when you look at a situation like we have in the States where we do nothing to defend ourselves, like nothing to defend our image, um, it's painful to watch the decline of the perceived moral value of the US since like the Bush era, going like completely unaddressed. Like there is no countervailing measure of saying, you know what, like yeah, we're not perfect as a nation, but for fuck's sake, like we're a pretty decent place, right? Like that doesn't happen at all. So it's just painful as like a first generation American to watch that shit and just feel like there's no countervailing narrative and no hope that at some point someone's going to be like, all right, enough. Like let's get some perspective.
And on that high note, let's switch to North Korea very quickly. We had news this week that Kim Suk-hee reappeared on Monday and had some thoughts, some information out on them targeting this Deal Defense, a German missile and ammo company that makes air-to-air missiles. I believe it's the IRIS-T air defense systems. Costin, you mentioned that Seung-Soo, a former colleague of ours, did a talk on this at HitCon. What can you tell us about what we know about Kim Suk-hee recent targeting?
I think there's actually not a lot of public details, and here's to hoping that HitCon is going to publish Seung-Soo's talk, and I also hope that maybe he will put together a more detailed blog
Where
post
is
as well.
Seung-Soo these?
South Korea. He's
is he working at a specific
in the
company?
right place, knowing what's happening.
Is he independent?
With that? No, he's with the Zscaler, if that's what you're
Zscaler,
asking.
okay. Yeah.
He's with Zscaler. And he does write blogs from time to time. I think he published one recently, about 2 months ago, if I'm not mistaken, about his favorite subject, obviously North Korean APTs. And I think it would be very interesting to see more details from him. But yeah, not particularly about this case with Dil, but in general about what Kim Suk-hee is doing. And actually, Kim Suk-hee has been super, super active recently. I'm monitoring the amount of domains they're registering, and I think of all the North Korean APTs, these guys are probably the most noisy. Like they're putting up the highest number of CNCs.
The missile sector targeting just reminds me of an op that Tom Hagel and Alex Milinkoski over at Labs put out last year, I think, where they found there'd been like a similar attack on a Russian missile engineering company. So it does, and I think at the time that notion was a little controversial. This idea that
Yes, I remember.
communist friends, right, that they would betray each other this way. But it is sort of very consistent to see Kim Suk-hee just trying to fulfill that missile engineering mission, just to show how strategic the North Koreans have become with their cyber.
Fits into our previous conversation of largely underestimating them, but these guys are on to really, really big things. And I want to pivot quickly to the other North Korea item in the news is their infiltration of crypto companies. We've talked in the past about the fake IT workers breaking into, getting past hiring practices and getting into US companies. CoinDesk had a story about more than a dozen crypto companies, apparently some of the bigger ones, say Zero Land, Phantom, Sushi, Yearn Finance, Cosmos Hub. I've never heard of any of these magic money people, but I imagine they're big. I imagine they're big and they're important. And the idea that the North Koreans, we've known in the past that the North Koreans have target crypto banks and target kind of this industry. Now that they have people embedded in there, I mean, this should set your hackles high. Does this story shock you, Costin?
I was thinking what is the main issue? How can they actually hire people who are based in North Korea and actually fall for it? And I think the issue here is that a lot of these magic money companies, like you call them, they just hire people to do remote work. They do the interviews over Zoom or whatever. They look at the person like without meeting them face to face. They talk a bit, and you're hired. And then you have access initially maybe to a small project within the magic money company, and then slowly, maybe and surely, they have more access or the ability to put backdoors into the smart contracts. In reality, this is what we discussed before. The North Korean people, well, Lazarus the Blue Norov and Dariel and so on, they're the best. I mean, they've become the best in the industry at hacking smart contracts, finding vulnerabilities in smart contracts, stealing cryptocurrencies, laundering cryptocurrencies. They're the best, and I mean, some of the attacks that we have seen are just mind blowing. From, let's say, exploiting race conditions in compilers, like certain compilers had vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities were race conditions, which would just get embedded into pretty much any smart contract compiled with that. And they had the ability to reverse engineer with the equivalent of hexarrays, for smart contracts. They reverse engineered that and successfully exploited those smart contracts to steal the magic money. So that's, in my opinion, is very impressive. I blame the magic money companies for not doing more scrutiny work and hiring people without even meeting them, face to face. But I think, they're gonna pay the price for it. I understand the need to hire remote workers, but when you're working with money, even if it's magic money, maybe you should pay more attention to whom you're hiring.
It's not the magic money people though. Like it's not just them, right? Like we saw that FBI
No before.
warning
No
about
before is a
this.
big.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think it's just an issue with the general like outsourcing culture, and this idea that like in every report there seems to be some line about you know coworkers seem to have suspicions and had flagged weird behavior because this person would never turn on their
Get on a
video,
video call, yeah.
never. Yeah, like it seemed like there were three different people talking and whatever. Like there's definitely an id gaff element to like some of this remote working. What I think is kind of fascinating, hilarious, and terrifying is the fact that like a random remote worker who you don't seem to place any scrutiny on gets access to production like openly in like in complete ways, right? And the magic money thing, like it shows immediately, but how many other industries has this resulted in like important information making it out, or like the modification of certain things, or other accesses long term that folks can't tell? And look, this is where like some of the business folks need to get smart. I have been talking to some folks who work in companies that deal a lot with like payroll and important parts of like big companies, and they don't seem to feel that there is a service or any kind of verifier that they can quickly turn to and say, hey, how much do you want, like as long as you're the one that's like going to screen and tell me that this is a real person and certify that they're legal and blah 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 blah. There is none. That seems to be the perception. So this is a great time if somebody wants to pop up with some great solution, but I also wouldn't be so quick to blame some of these companies, especially smaller companies, because it's like some of it is scrutiny, some of it is really there is no solution that you can quickly turn to and say, well, I paid $50 per applicant, which is insane, but they have verified that this person is real and is where they say they are and blah blah
I
blah.
cannot understand how you're shipping laptops to a laptop farm somewhere in Virginia and you're sending a paycheck somewhere in China. Like somebody's getting the paycheck and moving it. And I understand there's a lot of Americans involved in the system to facilitate and handle this. But I mean, Juan, is it possible that someone can sneak by on your team as a fake North Korean
Not
worker?
on my team, but I mean, I think that it's a serious source of concern for any company that's employing remote workers.
You got to do better at your HR practices, though. I mean, the idea that there's this entire ecosystem that you're falling for at this kind of scale, it's got to be.
I agree with you, but frankly, I don't believe in any situation that is improved by, well, everyone's got to get better at X. I think in true American fashion, we need to be providing some kind of semi-centralized service that you can go to and be held to a certain standard. Because like look at the magic money people, right? Like we're making fun of them, but those ridiculous companies are like 20 people. What verification do we expect them to be able to do? Like, fine, they didn't turn on the camera in those cases, but like that doesn't mean they won't, right? Like,
Yeah,
it
but I
doesn't
feel like
mean
when
that
you're
they
at
can't.
20 people, it has to be easier to spot this. This is only a problem when you're at 20,000 people. If you're at 20, if you're a crypto company with 25 people, you cannot have two North Koreans sitting there in IT. I mean, that's crazy pants to me.
I mean, what if they're North Koreans pretending to be like Indian IT support people? Everyone's outsourcing their IT to India. Everybody is there's people outsourcing security, research, and engineering work to like random people in India, which is fine, except like
This isn't a
how
fixable
is
problem? You're basically saying this isn't a fixable problem. We're talking about this in a year from now?
no, no, no. I'm not saying that it isn't a fixable problem. I'm saying it's a very fixable problem, but this isn't the angle of this is not the security part of it. Like this is a cost cutting cogs mentality to workers that is introducing another layer of vulnerability that is not being accounted for. And this started much before any of this North Korea shit. It started with these fucking business process outsourcing companies, which were a part of this disaster with Lapsus and Star Fraud and all those dudes, where it was like, oh yeah, why is like every telco getting popped over and over and over and over and over again by these 17-year-olds? It's like, well, because the 17-year-olds have popped the business process outsourcing companies and therefore have permanent access to every one of their customers. It's like that is the beginning, I think, of this kind of almost industrialization of vulnerability by virtue of like just outsourcing everything to random folks.
I just feel, Costin, we'll be talking about this a year from now. Like this is not an issue that we'll ever get ahead of because those guys are so aggressive. That, like you said, it's money, it's life and death for a lot of those folks. It's a difference between eating and not eating. So they're not going away. And we're not going to do better at our HR practices. Nobody's going to turn on cameras. So we're just going to be in this world until it really, another G10 appears.
You know, I was asking Seongsu actually if can you recognize if someone is from North Korea from the accent if you speak to them?
Interesting.
He said absolutely. I mean, it's immediately recognizable. And I was wondering if it's possible to design some kind of an AI that listens to the conversation and says, yes, this is a North Korean accent, or they're speaking with a North Korean accent.
There's Costin finding AI use cases for cybersecurity.
there was someone with a better idea, and they said, like one of the interview questions needs to be, please curse the supreme leader, or please say a couple of bad things about the supreme leader, and record it. And they tried this
Just
with an applicant, and he immediately disconnected when he heard the question. He was off immediately.
Yeah, but that means you have your
garlic outside of your company, essentially.
Yeah, that means you're waving a red flag. The problem is that you're not waving a red flag until someone comes aboard and say, hey, by the way, this guy is North Korean. Anyway, last item, we're running out of time, and I want to touch this before it gets late. Last week, when we talked about Apple withdrawing its lawsuit against NSO Group, Juan, you dropped in there the word Paragon that I had never heard of before. You said, hey, why aren't they suing Paragon? And immediately after that podcast, I saw Wired have an article out saying that the U.S. ICE, our very own Immigration and Customs Enforcement Group, has a 1-year contract with this Paragon U.S. subsidiary to use their commercial spyware product. So it seems like, and you were talking about this last week, the U.S. government have a policy, but we also have these federal agencies actually relying on these things. Where are we with U.S.'s own use of the spyware thing that we are frowning on?
Well, I think we need to remember that there's never been a sense that the government was not going to buy offensive tools, right? Like all we've been saying is it's not even that like we disapprove of other governments buying offensive tools, but
it's
rather
the indiscriminate using.
Yeah,
right?
that there's this like indiscriminate sales cycle with no purview and no oversight. That's enabling countries that are like abusers for a long time and so on and so forth. And you know that's not entirally disingenuous.
So we're okay with these tools.
I'm not saying that we're okay with them. I'm saying
That's what you just said.
No. I'm saying that what the efforts we have seen at outlawing or sanctioning or whatever have to do with the misuse of the tools. And frankly, the abuse of them is kind of baked into the model of any kind of like international lawful surveillance sales. because the issues that you get into here have to do with oversight, and there's this bizarre mentality in that market that says we only sell to law enforcement agencies, therefore what we're doing is lawful. And that is not something that logically stands to reason in any sense, especially when you see companies like, we've been going through the whole hacking team archive and whatnot. There's a situation with Hacking Team where it looks like they may have been duped in Turkey into selling to a faction of policemen that were not a part of the Turkish police. They were not doing so in an official capacity, and Hacking Team sold to them anyways. But what really gets me as a kicker is, in my understanding of Turkish law, the police are not legally allowed to wiretap anyways. It's only MIT, their signals intelligence agency. So what you were doing was not lawful, even if you were selling to the police. Like, there's a complete disregard for local legal frameworks as a part of that discussion. So in many ways, that market is being very hand wavy and disingenuous about its engagement with its clients. And any situation where like VC is involved and you're selling outside of your country of immediate like legal remit, abuse tends to follow. So it's not all bad on its face, but the setup it's not prone to good outcomes.
Costin, why is NSO Group evil and Paragon is okay? What do we know about these Paragon people?
I think being evil or not is here a very complex question, in the sense that the issue with NSO, I think, has always been they were selling to a lot of strange people and strange governments, and everything was probably okay until some of those started targeting US officials, US politicians, the
Khashoggi.
president of France, and so on. So that's when the problem appeared, I think, the abuse, essentially. And with Paragon, maybe we don't know much about them, but maybe the level of abuse is not on the same level, maybe just yet. So I think that's the difference that really matters in this case.
I think the
All
more
right,
interesting thing to discuss here, Ryan, just real quick, is the fact that we seem to be at a serious shortage of solutions in that space if we need to keep going back to like Israeli companies as like the only source of things like Celebrite, NSO, Paragon. Like, you just have this like this whole mobile space seems to be incredibly crimped to the point where like we're just kind of hoping for the next Israeli house to pop up to have a solution. And like, I'm happy for Startup Nation to do well, but I'm kind of curious and impressed and mystified and confused at seeing how much lack of like apple pie eating like good old American enterprises there are to like serve this solution. And I wonder what that's about. I wonder if there's like a required remove from Apple's immediate jurisdiction to be able to do this effectively, for example.
All right, let's leave it right there. Costin, you want to close with some shout outs this week?
Again, shout outs to all the people at Virus Bulletin, presenting speakers. I think Juan, you were also a speaker there, if I'm not mistaken. So shout out to all these people. Back in the days, by the way, Virus Bulletin was the place where you went if you wanted to hire somebody new, like a new researcher. So it was one of the essentially top events for pretty much all new analysts to go there and make a talk. Unfortunately, I missed it, so I'm a bit sad about that. But hopefully, I'll be able to go again next year. So shout out also to the organizer, to Helen, to Allison, and to the entire Virus Bulletin team for putting together yet another event.
Good people. Juan, some closing shout outs?
I mean, likewise to Helen in particular, I've given this delightful woman a really hard time over the years. I think like 5 or 6 papers that she's had to edit in a rush at the last possible second, and she's always been incredibly gracious to me. So yeah, VB, I think VB gave me the platform to publish some of the papers in my career that have had the most lasting value and seem to have resonated the most with folks. And, you know, the opportunities to collaborate with Brian Bartholomew and Costin and, you know, just have like a really interesting way to contribute. In my recent keynote, you know, one of the things I mentioned is we don't have a lot of publications or journals or anything that are just meant for us, like just to talk analyst to analyst, peers, and like just share industry techniques. And to be fair, VB is one of the last of those, you know, well curated journals that is putting that out and puts it as a sort of soft requirement to giving a talk. So you're forcing people that otherwise wouldn't spend the time to write a paper to actually do a reasoned discussion that's not for customers, it's not for marketing, it's just for other industry peers. So shout out to them, and I hope that can be kept alive and somehow expanded upon in some more meaningful way.
And from me staying in the conference circuit, this year is the 20th anniversary of Echo Party. I want to give a big shout out to Federico and the crew down in Argentina, Buenos Aires, that put on a show there. That's an incredible conference. Mm-hmm. I went there and I gave a talk last year. It's like the highlight of my life. The folks down there are amazing. Juan, you got accepted to speak there along with Gabe. I saw them put out two announcements. So the podcast will be well represented down in Buenos Aires. Eat all the steak, drink all the wine, and we'll catch you guys next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.